Green eyes in a domestic cat are, genetically speaking, a problem. Not a problem for the cat, which is entirely indifferent to the theoretical complications its eye color creates for population geneticists. A problem for the domestication story. The main ancestor of every house cat alive today is a wildcat from the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, a subspecies called Felis libica, and that animal has amber eyes, gold eyes the color of old honey. The Near Eastern wildcat that sat at the origin of domestication, that first started hunting rodents near grain stores 10,000 years ago, did not have green eyes. So when researchers started mapping the genes behind domestic cat eye color and tracing them back through the genome to find their origin, the green eye genes led somewhere unexpected. They pointed away from the Middle East and toward a completely different ancient wildcat, one that had been evolving separately for hundreds of thousands of years in the forests of Europe. Eye color in cats comes down to one thing: how much melanin sits in the stroma of the iris. The stroma is the layer of tissue at the front of the eye, and its melanin content determines what color you see. High melanin density produces copper or deep amber. Moderate melanin produces gold or yellow. Low melanin produces green, because at low melanin concentrations, the physics of light scattering takes over. Light hitting the sparsely pigmented stroma scatters in a way that preferentially reflects green wavelengths, the same principle that makes the sky appear blue. No melanin at all produces blue, which is why blue-eyed cats carry a mutation that almost entirely suppresses melanin production in the iris. Green sits in the middle of this spectrum, requiring a specific and relatively narrow range of melanin concentration. Too much, and the eyes go amber. Too little, and they go blue. Green requires a particular calibration of the melanin pathway, and that calibration is written in the genome. The African wildcat, Felis libica, is the primary ancestor of every domestic cat alive today. This was established firmly by the 2007 Driscoll study and confirmed repeatedly by ancient DNA research since then. The African wildcat is distributed across the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of sub-Saharan Africa. It looks a great deal like a domestic tabby cat, which is part of why the relationship between the two was difficult to sort out for so long, but its eye color is consistently in the amber to gold range. The pigmentation genes in African wildcat genomes produce melanin at levels that push iris color toward the yellow-amber end of the spectrum. When you look at photographs of African wildcats taken in the wild, the eyes are bright gold. That is the baseline. That is what the founding ancestor brought to the domestic cat genome at the origin of domestication. A cat descended purely from that lineage, with no other genetic contribution, would have amber or gold eyes. The amber eye color of the African wildcat isn't incidental. It's functional in the wildcat's environment. The Fertile Crescent and North African landscapes where Felis libica evolved are open, dry, and sunlit. Amber and gold eyes in those conditions reduce glare and improve contrast detection against sandy and ochre backgrounds. The melanin level that produces amber eyes in the African wildcat is calibrated for hunting in open terrain under intense light. When those cats moved into human settlements, and eventually into houses, the functional advantage of amber eyes became irrelevant, because the cats were no longer navigating by the visual demands of open desert. But the genetics that produced amber eyes remained. The founding genome of the domestic cat was built for a landscape that most modern house cats will never see. The cat's iris is also one of the more complex pigmentation systems in the mammalian body. Unlike fur, where melanin is deposited in discrete follicles during growth cycles, the iris stroma maintains its melanin continuously and can shift slightly in color as a cat ages. Kittens are often born with blue eyes because melanin production in the iris hasn't fully activated. Over the first months of life, melanin accumulates and the eyes settle into their adult color. A kitten that will eventually have green eyes passes through a blue phase, then a gray-green phase, before arriving at the adult green. This developmental trajectory is itself genetically programmed. The timeline and endpoint of iris melanin accumulation are both determined by the same genetic loci that the 2020 study identified as carrying European wildcat variants in green-eyed cats. The developmental pathway that produces green adult eyes in a domestic cat is, at its genetic root, a modified version of the pathway that produces green eyes in a European wildcat living in a forest that the domestic cat's ancestors never inhabited. The European wildcat, Felis sylvestris, is a different animal from the African wildcat in ways that matter here. It's larger, more heavily built, with a distinctively thick and blunt tail. It's also considerably wilder in temperament than African wildcats, which is one of the reasons European wildcats were never independently domesticated, despite sharing the continent with humans for thousands of years. But its eye color profile is different from the African wildcats in one specific and relevant way. European wildcats have eyes that range from yellow-green to distinctly green. The melanin calibration in their irises sits lower than in African wildcats. The genetic variants controlling melanin production in the European wildcat iris push toward the green range rather than the amber range. When researchers sequenced European wildcat genomes and looked at the specific loci controlling iris pigmentation, those loci showed a consistent profile: lower melanin production, green spectrum eyes. The question that followed was whether those specific genetic variants had ever made it into the domestic cat gene pool. In 2020, a team of researchers published the most detailed genetic study of cat eye color ever conducted. The study used genome-wide association analysis, which means scanning across hundreds of thousands of positions in the genome simultaneously, and asking which positions correlate with which traits. The trait in question was eye color across a large population of domestic cats. What they found was that cat eye color isn't controlled by a single gene. It's influenced by multiple loci spread across different chromosomes, each contributing to the final melanin calibration in the iris. Several of these loci overlap with genes involved in melanin synthesis that are well characterized in other mammals, including humans. The HERC2 and OCA2 region, which is the primary driver of blue versus brown eyes in humans, has functional analogs in the cat genome that showed up in the association results. But the most interesting finding wasn't which genes were involved. It was where those genes' specific variants had come from. The genes sitting at the green eye loci in domestic cats had an unusual property. They matched the European wildcat profile more closely than the African wildcat profile. This wasn't true of the entire domestic cat genome, which, consistent with prior research, pointed overwhelmingly toward Near Eastern African wildcat ancestry. It was specific to the pigmentation loci controlling green eye color. Those particular positions in the genome showed variants that are common in European wildcats and rare or absent in African wildcats. The pattern was subtle enough that it wouldn't show up in a broad genomic analysis looking at overall ancestry. You had to look specifically at the eye color loci to see it. And when you looked there, the signal was clear. The green eye variants in domestic cats traced back to the European wildcat lineage, not the African wildcat lineage that founded domestication. The question of how European wildcat genetics entered the domestic cat genome has a complicated answer that involves 10,000 years of cats moving across continents with human populations. The Near Eastern domestic cats that spread west into Europe beginning around 8,000 to 9,000 years ago were already domesticated. They weren't being tamed from local European wildcats. They arrived in Europe as cats, carrying Near Eastern genetics. But when they arrived, they weren't arriving alone. They were moving into territory where European wildcats had been living for hundreds of thousands of years. European wildcats and domestic cats can interbreed. They produce fertile offspring. And while European wildcats are highly territorial and wild-tempered animals that don't voluntarily approach human settlements, Occasional contact between a domestic cat and a European wildcat in the forests and margins of early European farming communities would have happened. The offspring of those contacts would have carried a mix of domestic cat and European wildcat genetics. If those offspring were more tame than their wildcat parent, they would have stayed near human settlements. Their descendants would have interbred back into the domestic cat population. When researchers looked at modern European domestic cat genomes, they found a consistent low-level signal of European wildcat ancestry. Not a large signal. The overwhelming majority of the domestic European cat genome is Near Eastern, as expected from the original domestication. But scattered through the genome, concentrated at certain positions more than others, there are European wildcat variants that aren't present in Near Eastern cats or in domestic cats from regions where European wildcats never lived. East Asian domestic cats, which descended from Near Eastern cats that traveled along the Silk Road, show almost none of this European wildcat signal. European domestic cats show a measurable amount. The signal is consistent with occasional sporadic introgression events over thousands of years, as domestic cats and European wildcats shared the same landscape. Most of the European wildcat genome didn't survive in domestic cat populations, but some of it did. And the variants that survived most visibly are the ones sitting in the pigmentation pathway controlling eye color. If European wildcat ancestry is only a small fraction of the domestic cat genome, why are green eyes so common in house cats? The answer involves selection. When Near Eastern domestic cats first arrived in Europe, they would have had predominantly amber or gold eyes, matching their African wildcat ancestors. European wildcat introgression introduced green eye variants into some individuals in the population. Those individuals had green eyes. Green eyes, in the context of cat breeding and the human preference for visually striking animals, appear to have been selected for. Humans who kept cats and bred them, even informally, noticed eye color. Green eyes in cats are unusual enough to attract attention, and common enough to have been consistently present in European cat populations for thousands of years. The green eye variants that entered the domestic cat population through European wildcat introgression were maintained and spread, not because they offered any survival advantage to the cat, but because the humans living around those cats found them worth keeping. The selection pressure from human aesthetic preference is real and documented in domestic animal genetics. Dog coat color variants, cat fur pattern variants, and eye color variants in multiple species all show signs of having been selected for by human preference, even in the absence of any functional advantage. Green eyes in cats are not more useful than amber eyes for hunting or navigation. The cat's visual system works the same way regardless of iris melanin content. But green eyes are striking in a way that amber eyes, however attractive, are not. They read as unusual. In a population of amber-eyed cats descended from Near Eastern wildcats, a kitten with green eyes would have stood out. The humans who noticed it would have kept it. And 10,000 years of that low-level human selection, combined with the initial introduction of green eye variants from European wildcats, is why green-eyed domestic cats are now found all over the world. A green-eyed domestic cat is not a hybrid in any meaningful sense. Its genome is overwhelmingly domestic cat, with Near Eastern wildcat ancestry dominant throughout. The European wildcat signal is small, old, and concentrated in specific genomic regions. The cat behaves like a domestic cat, has the temperament of a domestic cat, and is a domestic cat in every practical classification. What the green eye genetics reveal is not a hybrid identity, but a historical event. Somewhere in the ancestry of that cat, thousands of years ago in Europe, a domestic cat and a European wildcat had offspring that survived and bred back into the domestic population. That event left almost no other trace in the genome. The temperament genes, the skull-shaped genes, the social behavior genes, all of those remained domestic. Only the eye color loci, where the European wildcat variant happened to be visually distinctive and humanly preferred, survived to the present day. The pigmentation pathway that produces green eyes overlaps with the pathway that produces certain coat colors. This is not coincidence. Melanin is melanin, and the genes that control how much of it gets deposited in the iris stroma are related to the genes that control how much gets deposited in fur follicles. Cats with green eyes are statistically more likely to have certain coat color patterns than cats with amber eyes, because the same regulatory variants that push iris melanin toward the low end of the range also influence coat pigmentation. Dilute coat colors, certain tabby pattern densities, and specific color distributions in multicolored cats all show correlations with green eye color in population data. The European wildcat ancestry that brought green eyes into the domestic cat genome brought a melanin regulation profile, not just an eye color gene. The full effect of that profile shows up in both the iris and the fur, which is why green-eyed cats tend to cluster in certain color categories. The eye color of a domestic cat is one of the few visible traits that records something specific about its deep ancestry in a way that can be read directly. Most of what a domestic cat looks like is determined by the Near Eastern African wildcat genome that has been shaping the species for 10,000 years. The tabby pattern, the skull proportions, the behavioral tendencies towards solitary hunting, the social tolerance that distinguishes domestic cats from most wildcats, all of that comes from the founding population. But green eyes are different. Green eyes are a signal from a different source, a wildcat that never contributed to domestication, that lived in European forests while the Fertile Crescent cats were being drawn into human settlements thousands of kilometers away. That European wildcat contributed its genetics to the domestic cat population only after domestic cats had already been cats for thousands of years, through chance encounters in the margins of early European farms, in forests where wild cats hunted and domestic cats sometimes wandered. The green that you see when you look into a green-eyed cat's face is not the color of the animal that started domestication. It's the color of the animal that joined the story much later, uninvited and mostly forgotten, surviving only in the specific piece of the genome that humans happen to find beautiful. The research that made this readable in the genome required decades of work building the reference sequences and population datasets that made fine-grained ancestry analysis possible. Early cat genome studies could tell you that domestic cats descended from African wildcats. Later studies could resolve which African wildcat population. Studies like the 2020 eye color analysis could zoom in on specific loci and ask where particular variants within those loci had come from, comparing them against wildcat reference genomes from different subspecies and different geographic populations. The resolution available now would have been impossible 20 years ago. And what that resolution shows, when you look at a green-eyed cat, is that you're looking at a record of ancient history written in iris pigmentation. The founding ancestor had amber eyes. The European interloper had green ones. And the cat sitting across from you, if its eyes are green, is carrying the interloper's genetics in one of the only places in the genome where that old encounter left a mark visible to the naked eye. The practical implication of the research is that eye color in domestic cats is a more informative trait than it appears. A cat with amber eyes carries the original African wildcat melanin calibration essentially unmodified. A cat with blue eyes carries a mutation that suppresses iris melanin production almost entirely. A different story from green eyes, and one not associated with European wildcat ancestry. A cat with green eyes carries something specific, a pigmentation profile that traces back to a wildcat lineage that was never domesticated, that contributed its genetics to the domestic cat population only through occasional contact events across thousands of years of European prehistory. The three eye colors represent three different genomic histories written in the same tissue, and the research now exists to read them. There is also a connection between green eye color and certain health traits in domestic cats that researchers are still working through. The melanin pathway genes that the European wildcat contributed don't only affect the iris. They influence melanin-related systems more broadly, including some aspects of immune function and stress hormone regulation that are melanin adjacent in the biological pathway. Whether green-eyed cats show any systematic differences in these areas compared to amber-eyed cats is an open research question. The 2020 study identified the genetic associations but didn't attempt to map all the downstream biological effects of the European wildcat variants beyond eye color itself. It's a question that will likely be answered as cat genomics research continues and larger datasets make it possible to look for subtle phenotypic correlations across the whole body rather than just in the iris. What the genome-wide association study also revealed was a geographic pattern in eye color distribution across modern domestic cat populations. Cats from Central and Western Europe show green eyes at higher rates than cats from the Middle East, North Africa, or East Asia. This gradient maps almost exactly onto the distribution of European wildcat populations, past and present. The further a domestic cat population is from the range of the European wildcat, the lower the frequency of the green-eye genetic variants. This isn't absolute. Green-eyed cats are found everywhere because cat movement with humans over thousands of years has mixed populations extensively. But the baseline frequency is higher where European wildcats lived, and lower where they didn't. The geographic pattern is one more line of evidence pointing toward the same conclusion. Green eyes in domestic cats are a local European contribution to a genome that was otherwise built somewhere else entirely. The African wildcat's amber eye genetics didn't disappear from the domestic cat gene pool when European wildcat introgression introduced the green eye variants. Both sets of variants are present in modern domestic cat populations, and they sort out differently in different individuals based on which combination of alleles they inherited. A cat that inherits 2 copies of the African wildcat melanin variants has amber or deep gold eyes. A cat that inherits 2 copies of the European wildcat variants has green eyes. A cat that inherits 1 of each has eyes that fall somewhere in the middle, often described as hazel or yellow-green. The distribution of these combinations across the global domestic cat population follows the patterns you'd expect, given the history of introgression concentrated in Europe and the subsequent mixing of cat populations through human trade and movement. Amber eyes still dominate globally because the African wildcat ancestry still dominates globally. But green eyes appear wherever European cats have traveled, which is effectively everywhere.